This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host Renee Williams. And today in studio we have Dr. Matt Springer talking with Amanda Duren. And Dr. Springer is an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management in the UK Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Dr. Springer, would you like to introduce your guest you have today?
Today I'm happy to have Amanda Duren, the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture Habitat Delivery Coordinator with us, hopefully to tell us a little bit about what she does. And thank you, Amanda, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, our audience has probably never heard of the Appalachian Mountain Joint Venture before. I was curious, can you tell us a little bit about what that is and maybe what are joint ventures in general? Because even for someone like me who's never worked with you, I was very confused on what you actually do.
Sure.
However, I know it's very important.
Absolutely. So joint ventures, and our joint venture in particular, they're partnerships, broad-based partnerships of state and federal agencies, nonprofit organizations, universities, and other partners that work together to restore and sustain birds and their habitats across the U.S. And our joint venture is focused on the Appalachian Mountain region from northern Alabama north up to southern New York.
That's a pretty wide range there.
Yes.
So how many states is that in total about?
Ooh, it's about 12 states. It's a little over 100 million acres.
So that's a big chunk.
So it's a big chunk. But there are a lot of common issues that the states and habitats face in that region. And if we're going to be able to tackle the complex issues that are facing birds and their habitats across that region, we need to work at scale. We need to be able to work at a level where we can have population level impacts for birds. And so sometimes you need to be able to work at a scale that is on the order of millions of acres.
But one of those states is Kentucky, correct?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Correct.
Yeah,
yes.
but like it's somewhere around, I think, 26 or 28 of our counties in eastern Kentucky fall within your joint venture.
Yeah, it's about the eastern third or so of the state.
I believe we have 4 joint ventures that fall within our we're kind of a unique situation. We have one of the most complex joint venture relationships with how many we have. The one out in western Kentucky is basically half of 4 of our counties. So
Right.
It's very small. And then we have the Central Hardwoods and the Great Lakes joint ventures are the other ones, I believe. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, and the only state that's fully encompassed in our joint venture is actually West Virginia. So this situation you're describing is more common than you'd think for states. And the reason for that is because, of course, birds don't recognize our political boundaries. So they
Not
don't
just
care
birds, other ones too.
Yeah.
Other species of wildlife.
Right. So we are designing the joint ventures to encompass habitat types. And so sometimes those lines don't line up with where our state lines are. But it makes it easier to tackle some of the same issues that we're facing if we're looking at it more of a biological basis than a political one.
Yeah, the Appalachian Mountains look pretty similar from top to bottom, don't they?
There's a lot of diversity. Actually, if you're all the way up in the southern part of New York, it's a lot different than when you're down.
Different trees? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of diversity, and I'm always surprised. I get to travel a lot as part of my job, and I get to see a lot of those different habitats and a lot of different birds. And there's a lot of diversity even within our own joint venture. But there are enough parallels and enough overlaps in the issues, especially, that we're able to work with partners across that whole geography to try to get more habitat on the ground for those species.
So you've only mentioned birds, but obviously what you do has larger impacts than just, say, our migratory birds. The folks that you work with, are they only always interested in birds, or is there generally other people that have, say, herp interests or mammal interests? Or is it, do you have examples of how that may come in?
Yeah, absolutely. So when joint ventures first started, they were very focused only on waterfowl. And in about the last 10 years, they broadened that focus to include all birds. But from there, we're recognizing that the habitat work that we're doing for birds is, of course, not existing in a vacuum. We are improving habitat for a variety of different species. And so most of the partners that we work with, they have the responsibility, if they're a state or federal agency, or the interest, if they're a nonprofit, in benefiting populations of a whole range of species. So the work that we're doing for birds, it can benefit aquatic species like brook trout. It can benefit insects like monarch populations. It can benefit reptiles. All different kinds of species are benefiting from the work that we're doing. So it's not just birds that we're benefiting by doing the work that we are within this region.
So you mentioned the practices as like a big goal. What kind of practices are you hoping to get on the ground, and are there bigger interests? So we're, obviously that entire section of our state is all forested, and the forest industry is a big part of that. How do you guys, I know that you very much are interested in getting them involved, and they're a major tool for getting the habitat you're looking at on the ground. So can you explain a little bit about like the habitat we have is mostly mature forests. What are you trying to do in those areas, and why? And how are you using, say, things like the forest industry to accomplish those goals? And why what you do actually has a bigger impact economically than most people would ever imagine?
So considering the geography of our joint venture, most of it is forested. So the focus of a lot of our work is forest management. And the history of most of the forests in the eastern U.S., including Kentucky, is that a lot of the trees were cut in the early 1900s, late 1800s. So it's sort of a starting point where all of the trees that are growing back were the same age, where historically the forest would have some areas that were younger, some that were older. But our forests in the eastern U.S. now are generally all sort of middle-aged. They're all about 120, 130 years old. And that benefits birds that like forests that are that age, and wildlife that like forests that are that age, but it's very uniform. And so there are species that need younger forest, and there are species that need older forest. And forest management is a tool that we can use to try to create those conditions that are favoring species that like young forest. So doing sustainable forest harvest can help us create young forest. So when we're creating young forest habitat, we go in and remove most of the trees in those stands. And that lets the sunlight reach the forest floor and encourages lots of growth of shrubs and things like raspberries that are a good food source for lots of wildlife. And then there's also mature forest, and there's a lot of birds and wildlife that are looking for the type of habitat that only happens after a forest has been able to grow for 200 years or more. And we can sit around and wait for that habitat to come. But there are also some forest management techniques that we can do that help to encourage those features. So we can do things like crop tree release, which is essentially selecting the best trees in that stand and removing the competition around that tree to help it grow bigger. And so there are different practices we can do to promote the features that are normally associated with mature forest. But of course, as you mentioned, the forest products industry is really important in being able to get this management done on the ground. So there are pulp mills, for instance, in some parts of the Appalachians that will pay landowners for some of the smaller, lower quality trees that are in those forests. And if we are able to remove that, it creates better growing conditions for the larger trees. So there's a relationship there between the industry, the forest products industry that's going to be buying those smaller trees, and then the landowner gets a little bit of money for being able to do that, but also makes it possible to have those trees cut.
Yeah, because without those industry outlets, you don't have money to pay landowners to get rid of these things. You need that being able to sell the timber and have that pulp mill also buying logs to even get that out of the woods, correct?
Well, that helps a lot. If there's already a market, that makes it a lot more feasible. But there are programs through, for instance, the Natural Resources Conservation Service has a lot of programs that private landowners can apply to receive financial assistance to do some of these management practices that maybe wouldn't be beneficial for them to do commercially. So no one's going to pay them to do those practices. No forest industry is going to pay them to do those practices, but the NRCS programs can help offset some of those out-of-pocket costs. And the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture works very closely with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, with private forest landowners in a number of states to do practices that promote healthy forests, both young forests and then mature forests that we talked about.
You were mentioning that there's animals that like different types of forests. Give us some examples of what those animals are and why they prefer a young to an old.
Sure. For young forests, the species that we're really focused on in the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture is golden wing warbler. Mm-hmm. And that is a species that needs young forests. They nest in young forests within the Appalachians. And that habitat type is really declining across their range. So without that habitat, their populations have also very much declined since we started measuring them about in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. So as we are able to start creating young forests, those populations are starting to respond in areas where we put young forests on the ground. But in addition to golden wing warbler, there's lots of other species that use young forests. There's species like ruffed grouse likes after a harvest, about 10 years or so, they'll come in and start using that habitat. Rabbits, deer, turkey, a lot of game species like young forest. Mm-hmm. So there's a number of different reasons to create young forest on the landscape. But then as far as mature forest, the species that we focus on primarily within our joint venture is the cerulean warbler. They are looking for a very specific type of forest. They like areas that have a lot of forest in the landscape, but then have scattered openings. So that would be, historically that would happen when something like a tornado came through and opened up an area. But we can use forest management to try to create those conditions instead of waiting for a tornado to come through.
Right. So why do the animals prefer young to old? What's the difference?
I think you're getting into some evolutionary
okay.
aspects there.
I'm just trying to figure out, is it just the brush underneath?
Some of it has to do with food source, right, and what they eat. So you get into insect diversity in communities of young forest is a lot higher and more abundant. So that has a lot to do with it. And then there's a lot of diversification. So
because like ruffed grouse likes a bushy kind of area,
they
right?
like 5 to 15-year-old forest, and that has a lot to do with the fact that they get eaten.
Yeah.
So it provides them both food and cover to keep
Makes
them alive.
Makes sense on why they would want a young forest.
Correct. So that makes it harder for their predators like bobcats and potentially like gray foxes to find them, or hawks, owls, those kind of things.
Okay.
So
if you can imagine yourself standing in a young forest, it's really hard to walk through.
Right.
It's difficult to see very far ahead of you, and so you can imagine that as a species, you would bring your young there because they're much more protected from predators. So even if birds don't nest in young forest, a lot of times they'll move into young forest right after they leave the nest, or as they are first becoming mobile. They'll take them to young forest because the cover there is so much denser.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's even the species that prefer old growth forests. Now we've found out with advances in science and technology that we put transmitters on baby birds, and they flock to those areas, and we never even thought about that occurring up till recently, and so that diversification on the landscape is not just benefiting the species that love the early successional, but it's also benefiting the species that actually prefer older forests too.
Okay. Yeah, cerulean warbler is a
Speaking
great
of
example.
birds.
Yeah.
So there's naturally and historically there was, as Amanda mentioned, that diversification across the landscape. We didn't have this uniform age class, and that's what these animals learned how to survive with. So we're trying to replicate that now that we don't have what we used to have in terms of the landscape and disturbance and those kind of things.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. stay tuned towards the end of the show. We'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
So, Amanda, you don't live in Kentucky. You're not from Kentucky, and I know that because I'm from pretty much where you're from. You're here visiting us. Can you talk a little bit about why you're here specifically and what that may mean for, say, your landowners here in the near future, and why they should care why you're here?
Yeah. I'm really excited to be invited to come out to visit you here in Kentucky. It's only my second time ever visiting the state. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty new in my position. I just started back in December. Previous to that, I had worked only within Pennsylvania, which is still where I'm based. But now in this new position, I'm able to work across the whole joint venture geography, which has been really exciting. And the main focus of my position is to try to implement our focal landscape initiative. And the motivation behind the Focal Landscape Initiative is that recognizing that we can't build the kind of complex, broad partnerships that we need to build to be effective in conserving birds. Can't do that at the whole scale of our joint venture. It's just too big of an area. So we're going to our partners in each of those states and asking them where are the highest priority areas for them that we should be focusing to be able to do these broad-based partnerships. So I'm here in Kentucky trying to talk with partners from state and federal agencies here at the university to get an idea of what conservation issues you're facing, what your highest priorities are for species, not just birds, but the species that you're working on, and see how I can help to get those partnerships started, how we can play a role in helping you get the conservation work done that you want to do at scale here in Kentucky.
And that obviously takes many different tools, and some of those tools involve a relationship with National Resource Conservation Service, as you mentioned, and potentially money for landowners in those focal areas to help get habitat on the ground. So our landowners would care because if they live within those identified focal areas, all of a sudden there may be some knocking on the door, or necessarily from us an email or two, if you know our department and work with an extension, to see if you're interested in trying to help out and accomplish the goals that you're specifically working on, and a little bit of what I work on the fringe. Yeah. So your attendance here may actually mean money in their wallets later, potentially.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Just like birds don't recognize what state boundaries we draw on a map, they also don't recognize whether it's public land or private land where they choose to live. So we need to be working across those boundaries in our focal landscapes if we're going to be effective. So in all of the focal landscapes that we are hoping to establish, they're going to include a mix of public and private land management is very important in the work that we do. And in some other states, we do have financial assistance programs that we've been able to work with our partners on developing for private landowners. And that is a model that we hope to bring to Kentucky. So as we start to work with our partners to identify what our priorities are, where exactly we want to be working, how we can engage private landowners in that effort is going to be something that we're considering from the beginning.
Okay, excellent. Amanda, I really appreciate you being here and talking about what you do and what we're hoping to get started here in Kentucky and throughout the joint venture. Do you have a website or a Facebook page that maybe if someone was interested in learning more about what you're doing, that they could go to and read all about what's going on and potentially see some pictures and all kinds of other fun things?
We do. We have a website, amjv.org. And on that website, we have a specific section for private landowners where we have resources that we can connect you with professionals working in your area, some financial assistance programs to do management that might be available in your area. So that could be a great resource for folks. And we also have a Facebook page as well for fun content and sharing some news and updates. And we have coloring pages for the kids. So
every Friday, I see them.
Another question is, do they have to have a specific amount of acres to be able to participate?
No. So
just be within the boundaries is
right.
Basically one of the...
Again, we're very early in the process here in Kentucky, but the smallest landowners can contribute in many different ways. Okay. So you don't have to own hundreds of acres to have an impact on birds. And there are some resources on our website of what you can do even in your backyard if you don't own forest land, things you can do to benefit birds there as well.
Okay.
So thank you for taking your time out of your day here, and I know you're getting ready to travel back home, but we appreciate it, and you better bet that when things get rolling, we're going to drag you back in here and talk again.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, Amanda.
If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned now for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
All right, I'm not quite sure what that one is.
Yeah, that's one that not a lot of people, they may hear it, but not put two and two together because where it's coming from is really tiny. And that's because it's coming from a chipmunk.
A chipmunk,
an eastern chipmunk, yes. So it's a very common species we see in Lexington, right?
Right, they're all over the place.
They are, and to some people's, they really wish they wouldn't see them very much.
Yeah, they ate all my bulbs.
Yes, they're not the gardener's friend. I have problems with them myself personally in trying to get sunflowers to grow. They eat my sunflower seeds and the seedlings quite quickly whenever I do get them outside. Yeah. But they're also a major driving factor in our forests.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they are a fairly common rodent, okay, who loves to eat seeds, which is the reason why we have such a problem with them when we try to plant things.
Okay. So other than sunflowers, what other seeds do they like?
Oh, man, they eat a lot of different things, from fruits, right? So you can have blueberries if you're in your backyard, or blackberries. But they may, in the wild, they'd be after things like wild grapes, or sumacs, acorns, beech nuts, you name it on the seed front. They're pretty diverse diet-wise. So they consume, plants, they'll eat just buds and green vegetation to mushrooms to you name it. Yeah, they eat a lot of different things. They really do.
And they dig tunnels underneath.
They are a tunneling species, and they will have those and use those as a burrow for safety. And those tunnels can get rather intricate. Based on, say, like predators. So, like, I have a big problem in my backyard where as soon as they found out my dogs were around, all of a sudden I see tunnels and holes everywhere because of that. So it's definitely used as an escape mechanism. But they do other things, like they have, starting right now, not just right now, but the last couple weeks, they're really working on their pantry.
Pantry?
Or
okay,
hoard.
Explain that.
So in order for them to make it through the winter, they have to build up, just like we think of squirrels burying nuts. These guys don't bury nuts across the landscape. What they actually do is they collect them and put them in one or two different stashes or hoards. And that's how they survive when they can't get out and find nuts, is they actually build up their own little pantry of acorns and whatnot. That keep over winter. Yeah.
Interesting.
So they go through a little bit of torpor, so they don't truly hibernate, but they'll wake up every couple days. They'll sleep through some days. They'll wake up, and when they wake up, they have to eat. So they'll go to that little hoard, that pantry that they have, and consume, and then they'll probably repeat that cycle until spring comes. So about how many months are they doing this? Well, so it depends on the weather. So the warmer it is, the longer it is, they're going to be awake. So if it's really cold, and we have a really cold streak that we commonly do, say January, February, they're going to pretty much shut down. And may wake up every couple days just to eat a little bit. But it depends on weather. Yeah.
So now when it gets warm, say we have sometimes we'll have like a week of warm weather, and then it'll go back to snow. Do they come out then, or do they stay underground?
They'll wake up. Yeah, so they'll take advantage of that. A lot of it's based on metabolism, right? And then also the environmental factors that allow them to go out and collect food, right? So if it's really cold, them going and looking for food at that point in time is more costly than if it's warmer and they're looking for food. So they try to balance that.
All right. Yeah. So what about kids?
Kids? I mean,
Yeah.
do they have kids?
Do they have? Well, yeah, of course they have them.
They
somewhere.
have to have kids, otherwise we wouldn't have chipmunks.
Right.
So they'll have basically 2 litters a year if they're healthy, spring and then late summer, anywhere between 3 and 5 young. And those guys will, at the end of that, disperse and leave. They're pretty much solitary outside of that period of time, mating season, reproduction season. Mom will have her litter, and then when they're grown, they're gone. So they'll live about 3 years in the wild if they make it through that first little bit and survive. But in captivity, they've been known to live up to about 8 years. So they're fairly long-lived. Kind of like our squirrels are kind of the same way, where they'll make it a few years if they make it through when they're young and learn to survive. But and often people see them, especially in their yards, where they'll have their cheeks puffed out. And little kind of fun fact is they can fit up to 7 nuts in their cheeks at one time and carry them around, which helps them make those trips back to that pantry a little
Kinda
bit
like
more
their
worthwhile.
luggage.
Yes, very much like carrying their luggage, all in their cheeks. So, but they're definitely a species that, based on what kind of seeds they eat in a forest, they can drive what plants may regenerate by, if they eat all the acorns, there's not going to be a lot of oaks left to come up.
Right.
So they can be a driving factor in our forest ecosystems.
Okay. So as far as having their young, and do they build nests? Or?
So they'll have little nests in their burrows. Yeah, they have those underground as well. So they're middle of the food chain. So they'll eat caterpillars and insects and all those things, but foxes, coyotes, snakes, owls, they're all after them.
I'll come after them. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming and talking about chipmunks.
No problem.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.